Somewhere in the northern Yukon, inside 3 limestone caves most Canadians have never heard of, there are mammoth bones with cut marks on them, parallel scoring, made by a stone tool. The bones are 24,000 years old. For 40 years, nobody believed it. The archaeologist who found them was pushed out of his field. His funding dried up. His claims were called premature, ambiguous, embarrassing. Then in 2017, a team at the University of Montreal put the bones under a better microscope. The cut marks were human. The dates were right. He had been correct the entire time. That is one site on this list. It is not the strangest one. Canada gets treated like a young country. Confederation was 1867. The flag is from 1965. Quebec City, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement, is just over 400 years old. The land feels new because the country does. The land is not new. There are burial mounds on the coast of Labrador older than the pyramids of Egypt. There are stone wheels in Alberta that were already ancient when Stonehenge was being built. There are petroglyphs on an island in the Hudson Strait, carved by a people who vanished so thoroughly they left almost no descendants at all. And there are places where the evidence simply will not behave. Tools in soil, layers that should be empty. Trade goods from 3,000 kilometers away. Populations too large for the food system that fed them. A 12-year-old child buried under a mound of stones 77 centuries ago, weighted down so the body would not rise. Some of these are mainstream archaeological mysteries. Some are fringe claims that collapse under professional scrutiny. A few are still being fought over in peer-reviewed journals right now, in 2026. These are 12 ancient sites in Canada that still do not make sense. We are starting in Newfoundland, on a rock where Vikings lived for a decade and then walked away. Number 12. L'Anse Meadows and the Vinland problem. Tip of the Great Northern Peninsula, Newfoundland. 26 kilometers north of St. Anthony. 3 sod-walled great halls, a forge, a boat repair shop, 800 Norse artifacts in the soil. This is the only confirmed place Europeans lived in the Americas outside of Greenland before Columbus. And thanks to an obscure piece of science involving the sun, we now know the date with terrifying precision. In the year 992, a massive solar storm bombarded Earth with cosmic rays. That spike is visible in tree rings all over the world like a global timestamp. In 2021, researchers counted the rings outward from that spike on 3 pieces of wood from the site to the bark edge. 29 rings. The trees were cut in the year 1021. 1,005 years ago, a Norse axe was ringing in the woods of northern Newfoundland. The site was identified in 1960 by a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad, guided by a local fisherman, George Decker, to what the locals had always called the Old Indian Camp. Decker was right about the importance, wrong about the occupants. Anstein Ingstad led 7 seasons of excavation and pulled buildings, a bronze cloak pin, a soapstone spindle whorl, a bone needle, and 11 worn-out fire strikers out of the earth. And butternut shells. That is the detail that matters. Butternut trees do not grow north of eastern New Brunswick. They never have. Butternut shells in a Viking layer in northern Newfoundland means a Viking went south and brought them back. 1,000 kilometers south. Minimum. So here is the actual mystery. L'Anse Meadows on its own is almost certainly not Vinland. Birgitta Wallace, who has spent more of her career on this than anyone alive, has argued for over 30 years that the site is a base camp. A winter station for a larger territory the Norse called Vinland, extending down into what is now New Brunswick and possibly the Gulf of Maine. Her exact words, paraphrased from decades of interviews. The site became clearly a base camp, and from that camp, the Norse went farther south. If she is right, there is more out there. Possibly another Norse site, possibly several. Nobody has found them, not for lack of trying. In 2016, a satellite archaeologist named Sarah Parkak announced a possible second Norse site at Point Rossi on the southwest coast. A BBC documentary was filmed. Nova got involved. A full excavation was launched. There was nothing there. Parkak's own final report to the Provincial Archaeology Office, November 2017, is blunt. No clear findings of human activity prior to 1800. None of the team members deemed the area as having any traces of human activity. A satellite hypothesis, in short, that got killed by a shovel. But the butternut shells are still in the museum. Somebody carried them north 10 centuries ago from a place that has not yet been found. That is where the mystery actually lives. Not in what we know about L'Anse Amour Meadows, in what the site is pointing at. Number 11. Head smashed in buffalo jump. Southwest Alberta, the Porcupine Hills. A sandstone cliff about 300 meters long. Current drop roughly 10 meters. Original drop closer to 20. The reason the drop got shorter is that the bones piled up at the bottom. Layer after layer for 6,000 years, until the bone bed itself was 12 meters deep. The name is head smashed in. The Blackfoot name is Estepus Skiki-Kinikots. It literally means where he got his head smashed in. It is not named for the buffalo. Piikani oral tradition carried by elders like Joe Crowshoe Sr. preserves the story. A young Blackfoot warrior wanted to watch the hunt from below. He tucked himself against the base of the cliff to see the animals plunge overhead. The carcasses piled up, they crushed him against the rock. When the hunters came down to start butchering, they found the boy dead, his head crushed between the cliff and the pile. The site was named for him. That is the first thing to know here. The second is the scale. Head smashed in is not a cliff that people chased buffalo off of. It is a system, a gathering basin in the hills where herds grazed. Stone cairn drive lanes funneled animals over 8 kilometers through progressively narrower channels. Runners in calf disguises imitated distress calls to guide the herd. A kill site, and a processing camp below the cliff where meat and hides were butchered and rendered into pemmican. Hundreds of stone cairns placed across the landscape for one purpose: to convince a bison herd from a distance that it was walking into a safe valley. The system worked for 60 centuries. It only stopped working in the 1870s when there were no more bison to jump. What doesn't add up is the silence in the middle. There is a gap in the bone bed record, a stretch during which the jump went cold. Nobody is sure why. Climate, disease, conflict between groups, every theory has a problem. And then there is a pit archaeologists opened in 1992. It was not a kill. It was not a processing site. Inside, 17 sets of articulated bison bones, portions of 15 skulls, a pottery vessel, bison mandibles shaped into tools, bones painted with red ochre, arranged with clear intention, buried with clear care. This is ceremony, which quietly rewrites the old model of the jump as pure subsistence engineering. The buffalo were not just food, they were what the Blackfoot have always said they were: family. A relation that required ceremony on both sides. Head Smashed In was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1981. There is an interpretive center carved into the cliff face, one detail most visitors never notice. The cast of the cliff inside the building, the one everyone photographs, is not from Head Smashed In itself. It is from the neighboring Calderwood Buffalo Jump. The real bone bed is just outside, 12 meters deep. Archaeologists have been sampling it for decades without fully exhausting it. Number 10. Kay-Nah-Chi-Wah-Nung, the Manitou Mounds. Picture a 3-kilometer strip of terrace land on the north bank of the Rainy River. Smooth ground, forested edges, the water moving past in wide, lazy curves. And then the earth rises in giant, deliberate humps where it should not rise. 15 burial mounds, 30 village sites, the largest mounds up to 7 meters tall and 24 meters across. All of it dug out by hand over centuries. The name is Kay-Nah-Chi-Wah-Nung, the place of the long rapids. The river in English is Rainy. In Anishinaabe-Moan, it is Manitou Zebi. Spirit River. The mystery is simple. Everything at this site came from somewhere else. Between about 300 BCE and 1100 CE, the Laurel Complex culture built the mounds and ran a trade network that looks impossible on paper. Lake Superior copper at the site, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians. All of it moving through this one stretch of river. Ohio is 3,000 kilometers south. The Rocky Mountains are 2,000 kilometers west. The Gulf of Mexico is further than either. No horses, no wheels, no riding. Archaeologists have argued for decades about how this worked. Direct trade, with laurel runners traveling vast distances and returning. Down the line exchange, where goods moved through dozens of hands over generations. Pilgrimage tied to shared ceremony? There is still no consensus. What is not in dispute is that the Laurel culture became the northernmost node of a continental exchange network that ran for more than 1,000 years and then quietly faded, without the kind of dramatic collapse story historians love. The Rainy River First Nations, whose territory this is, have their own account. One origin story shared by Elder Annie Wilson describes a great sickness. An elder was warned in a dream. The Great Spirit told her to build a lodge of birch bark to shelter the people. Many did not listen. Those who did not listen died. When the sickness passed, the survivors came out of the lodge and buried the dead in mounds. The site is owned and operated by the Rainy River First Nations. It is not framed as a museum. In the nation's own language, it is a continually evolving sacred community site. Most of the mounds have never been excavated. Most of them never will be. The mystery, in this case, is one the descendants have chosen to leave intact. Number 9. Petroglyphs, Kinu-u-Ma'agawabkong, Southern Ontario. An hour northeast of Peterborough. A slab of white crystalline marble, roughly 12 meters by 21 meters. On that slab, 900 figures. Snakes, boats, human-animal hybrids, beings with radiating solar headdresses. Handprints. Shapes nobody has ever conclusively identified. The largest figure is a 3-meter serpent. The deepest grooves are 7.5 centimeters into the rock. The Anishinaabe-Moan name is Kinu-Magwabkong, the rocks that teach. And the first strange thing is underneath. A spring flows through the limestone below the outcrop. When the air is still, you can hear water moving under the rock. The traditional interpretation is that this is the voice of the Manitou speaking through the stone. The modern interpretation is that it is groundwater moving through marble. Those are not necessarily competing explanations. They are two languages describing the same observation. The second strange thing is the date, or rather, the absence of one. The rock is inorganic, the patina cannot be dated. The most widely accepted attribution from Joan and Romus Vasticus's 1973 study places the carvings between 900 and 1400 CE based on stylistic comparison with Maida-Waiwan birch bark scrolls. It is an educated guess, not a measurement. Into that gap walks Barry Fell. Fell was a Harvard marine biologist who decided in the 1970s to also be an expert in ancient languages. In his book Bronze Age America, he claimed the petroglyphs were Proto-Tifinagh script, inscribed around 1700 BCE by a Bronze Age Scandinavian king named Woden Lethi of Ringerike, who had allegedly sailed to Canada to trade for copper. Joan Vastakas's response is still the best summary anyone ever wrote about fringe archaeology. In short, Fell never actually studied the site. He based his ideas on our book. That is not scholarship. A 1983 survey found 95% of professional archaeologists held a negative view of Fell's work. The pecking and grinding technique on the marble is physically incompatible with Tifinagh. The Bronze Age Norse were not sailing to Ontario in 1700 BCE. The claim is dead. It just keeps getting resurrected on the internet. What the site actually is, by every credible reading, is a sacred Anishinaabe teaching rock. Curve Lake First Nation are the spiritual custodians. And the most interesting current conversation around the site is not about who made it. It is about whether the protective building erected over the carvings in the 1980s should be removed and the rock allowed to weather away naturally. That idea comes from within the community and from Trent University archaeologist Jack Hogarth. The thinking is that the teachings were never meant to last forever. Old ones fade, new ones take their place. The preservation building might be the least indigenous thing about the site, which is a complicated, mature position that no fringe theory is ever capable of reaching. Number 8. Serpent Mounds, Rice Lake. Rice Lake, Kawartha region, southern Ontario. A small peninsula on the north shore, and a mound of earth shaped like a serpent. 59 meters long, curving in deliberate sinuosities, 1.5 meters tall. The only confirmed serpent effigy mound in Canada. 8 smaller oval mounds nearby, sometimes called the eggs, ranging 7 to 15 meters long. Built by the Point Peninsula culture in the Middle Woodland period, roughly 50 BCE to 300 CE. Over 1,900 pottery sherds came out of the stratified excavation, along with shell disc beads, copper foil, and distinctive pentagonal projectile points. Here is what should not exist. Serpent effigy mounds are a Hopewell culture thing. The famous example is the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, over 400 meters long, sitting squarely in the Hopewell heartland. The serpent at Rice Lake is nearly 1,000 kilometers north of that heartland, in a region that archaeologists do not usually associate with effigy mound building. It was built by a culturally distinct people, for reasons we cannot reconstruct from the material record. Was it direct cultural borrowing carried north by people who had traveled south and returned with a ceremonial idea? Was it independent development from shared spiritual vocabulary about snakes, water, and the underworld? Was it part of a religious network? Something like a pre-contact pilgrimage circuit spanning the eastern woodlands? The mound is silent on this. It was not built to explain itself. It was built to be a snake on a hilltop. The site sits on lands of Hiawatha First Nation, part of the Michi-Saagiig Anishinaabeg. Chief Robert Paudash in 1904 offered one interpretation. The serpent represented the Iroquois, the big snakes. The smaller mounds represented turtles. The whole thing commemorated a historical encounter between peoples. Hiawatha First Nation has forbidden further invasive excavation. In October 2025, they received over $800,000 in federal funding for revitalization work. The snake stays where it is. Nobody is going to pull it apart to figure out why it was built. Which means the answer to the obvious question, why is there a Hopewell-style earthwork 1,000 kilometers from the Hopewell, is for practical purposes permanently unavailable. Number 7. Keatley Creek, north of Lillooet, British Columbia. A bench of land 360 meters above the Fraser River. 1,000 years ago, there was a town here. 119 house pit depressions. The largest 21 meters across. Peak population estimates between 700 and 1,500 people. In one village in the interior plateau. That is where the math breaks. The Sintat-EMC people who lived at Keatley Creek were not farmers. They fished the Fraser River salmon runs. They gathered roots and berries. They hunted deer in the hills above. That is a hunter-gatherer economy. And hunter-gatherer economies, under the standard model, do not support 1,500 people in one place. You are supposed to need agriculture for that. The Maya had maize. The Mesopotamians had wheat. The Chinese had rice. Storable surplus produces dense settlement. That is the rule. Keatley Creek broke the rule, using salmon. The Fraser River salmon runs through that section of canyon are among the richest on Earth. Dried and smoked salmon store almost like grain. If the runs are reliable and the fishing sites are defended, you can build a town on fish. Which is what happened here during the classic Lillooet phase, roughly 2,400 to 1,100 years ago. But the bigger anomaly is inside the houses. Brian Hayden of Simon Fraser University excavated house pit. 19 meters across with 45 occupants and 8 separate family hearths between 1986 and 1996. He found evidence of economic inequality inside a single dwelling. Different families had access to better salmon, better stone, and more exotic prestige goods. Inequality inside a hunter-gatherer household. The textbook model says this should not happen. Inequality is supposed to require agricultural surplus, and the people of Keatley Creek did not farm. Hayden built a career arguing this was something he called trans-egalitarian inequality, rivalrous feasting among ambitious household leaders, accumulating status through competitive generosity. Anna Marie Prentice at the University of Montana has pushed back on Hayden's dates and his model in American antiquity. The debate is active. The anomaly is not. The village was eventually abandoned. One leading theory blames a rock slide at Texas Creek around the year 1000, which may have blocked the Fraser River and collapsed the salmon runs for generations. One last detail that lives rent-free at this site. The word Stetlium may itself derive from the name of the village at Keatley Creek. That would mean the people on this land today are named for the place their ancestors built and eventually left 1,000 years ago. Number 6. Qajartalik, Hudson Strait. A small peninsula of Qajartalik Island, 40 kilometers southeast of Qajartalik in Nunavik. A gray steatite outcrop rising from the rock. And carved into that outcrop, about 180 faces. Some anthropomorphic, some zoomorphic, some with horns, some with multiple heads, some showing what look like stages of transformation, something becoming something else, frozen mid-change in the stone. This is Qajartalik. It is the only site of its kind on Earth. The carvings were made by the Dorset culture. The Dorset, sometimes called the Tuniat in Inuit oral tradition, occupied the eastern Arctic for 2,000 years. Their range covered Nunavut, Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, Newfoundland, and Greenland. They quarried soapstone everywhere they lived. And yet petroglyphs by the Dorset exist at one major site. Here, plus 3 tiny sites on the Ungava coast. That is the entire known inventory across roughly a quarter of the North American landmass. A people who carved soapstone for 2,000 years chose to carve faces in rock in one specific place. Nobody knows why. Dating is approximate. No organic material is preserved in the stone itself. Based on stylistic comparison with Dorset ivory and wooden masks, the carvings are probably late Dorset, between 1000 and 1400 CE. The interpretation most favored by researchers like Daniel Arsenault of the Université Laval is shamanic. The faces may show stages in the transfiguration of a shaman or the shaman's spirit helper. Arsenault has also argued that production of the carvings intensified during the medieval warm period, as shrinking sea ice put pressure on Dorset seal hunting, and by extension on the shamanic practices that held the community together. The Inuit of Qangik-Sujuaq regard themselves as caretakers of the site today. Their oral tradition about the Tuniit is detailed, with stories of their strength, their shyness, and their distinctive tools, but it does not, in any recorded form, reference the faces at Qajartalik. The petroglyphs sit in a silence that oral tradition does not fill. 3 explanations are possible. The memory of the site was lost during the gap between Dorset and Inuit occupation. The site was considered too dangerous or too sacred to speak of to outsiders. Or the Inuit who spoke to early anthropologists made a choice about what to share. All 3 are still possible. Qajartalik was vandalized in the spring of 2006, which led to new protective measures. It was added to Canada's UNESCO tentative list in December 2017, and the people who made it, as we will see, are no longer here. Number 5, Majorville Cairn and Medicine Wheel. Here's what you see driving east out of Calgary toward the Majorville site. Flat prairie, big sky, a low rise covered in grass. On top of the rise, a deliberate circle of stones with a cairn at its center, spokes radiating outward, and offerings such as tobacco, cloth, and sweetgrass tucked into the rocks by people who were there that morning. The Blackfoot name is Iniskim Umaapi, Big Buffalo. This place is 5,200 years old. 5,000. Older than Stonehenge in its megalithic phase. Contemporaneous with the Step Pyramid of Djoser in Egypt. More than 17,000 artifacts have been recovered from the cairn, deposited in what one archaeologist called accretional fashion, layers in an onion. Projectile points from a dozen cultural phases, offerings, tool fragments, bone, artifacts. There is a documented gap in use from roughly 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, and then the site came back online. Continuous ceremonial use, all the way to European contact and still going today. Continuous. 3 things about it do not make sense. 3. First, nobody can say for certain what it is. Built and rebuilt over 5,000 years, its function almost certainly shifted. Burial cairn, calendar, memorial, vision quest site. Probably some combination at different times across different generations. Uncertain. Second, the geometry may not all be one project. Archaeologists have not been able to confirm that the outer spokes and ring were built at the same time as the central cairn. It is possible the wheel was added, centuries later, to an already ancient pile of stones. Geometry. Third, the astronomy, which is where Majorville becomes a problem. In 2009, a retired University of Alberta chemistry professor named Gordon Freeman published a book called Canada's Stonehenge. He argued that Majorville, together with surrounding features, forms a 26 to 30 square kilometers sun temple, with a calendar he claimed was more accurate than the Gregorian one we use now. The Canadian Archaeological Association has issued formal, cautious responses. The question is not whether the spokes line up with solar and celestial events. Some of them do. The question is whether those alignments were intentional or whether they are statistical accidents produced by any roughly radial stone structure. Jack Ives at the University of Alberta has put it carefully. There is some basis for thinking the builders had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. How much more sophisticated than that is still debated. The broader picture does not help. There are somewhere between 70 and 150 medicine wheels documented across the Canadian and American prairies. A famous 1974 study of the Bighorn medicine wheel claimed alignments with Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius with a chance probability under 1 in 4,000. A later statistical reanalysis by Bradley Schaefer found no significant stellar alignments at all. And at Moose Mountain in Saskatchewan, archaeologist Ian Brace pointed out that the internal stone crest is high enough you cannot see across the wheel. It is hard to run an observatory when you cannot see the horizon. One detail worth holding on to: the most recently built medicine wheel in Alberta was constructed in 1938 as a memorial to a Blackfoot leader. The tradition of building these is not extinct. It is, at minimum, alive within living memory. The ceremony is still running. The offerings still appear. The origin story of the Inniskim, the buffalo calling stones tied to the cairn, recorded by George Bird Grinnell in 1892, is still told. Whatever Majorville is, whatever it was built for, it has been in active spiritual use for longer than almost any other known site on the planet. Number 4. Sheguiandah. Sheguiandah sits on Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron, a quartzite knoll just north of the village of Sheguiandah. In the early 1950s, an archaeologist named Thomas E. Lee excavated this site for the National Museum of Canada. He was credentialed, serious, careful, and what he came to believe about what he found ended his career. Lee claimed that the lowest cultural level at Sheguiandah sat in glacial, till predating the last glacial advance. Stone tools and soil laid down by an ice sheet that retreated more than 30,000 years ago. A geologist named John Sanford from Wayne State University went further. He proposed that the oldest stratum might be 65 to 125,000 years old. That claim was an earthquake. The dominant model of the peopling of the Americas, the so-called Clovis First model, placed human arrival around 13,000 years ago. Sheguiandah was not off by a century, it was off by an order of magnitude. The reaction, by Lee's account, was ruthless. He wrote that the site's discoverer was hounded from his civil service position into prolonged unemployment. Publication channels were cut off. Evidence was misrepresented. The artifacts vanished into National Museum storage bins. And for refusing to fire Lee, the museum director was himself fired and, in Lee's phrasing, driven into exile. That is Lee's version. The basic facts of his professional treatment are not disputed. He was pushed out. He did struggle to publish. The artifacts did end up in storage for decades. Modern consensus, established by Patrick Julig and Peter Stork in the 1990s and the 2000s, is that Lee was partially right and partially wrong. Sheguiandah's main occupation is late Paleo-Indian, from 10,500 to 9,500 years ago. The apparent glacial till, they argued, was actually reworked beach sediment from an ancient lake phase. The artifacts in deep layers were the result of roots, rodents, and frost heave, not genuine deep time. They concluded Sheguiandah is a quarry, an important one, but not a pre-Clovis site. The debate did not stay unsettled. Lee's son, Robert Lee, published in Ontario Archaeology in 2013, arguing that the Julig and Stork reassessment was fundamentally flawed. The patterns in the refitted stone artifacts and the classed fabric of the sediment still look like undisturbed layers, he argued, not the product of thousands of years of rodent tunneling. As of 2026, the question is not formally closed. Sheguiandah is partially vindicated. The 1953 Ontario Archaeological and Historic Sites Protection Act passed because of Lee's work. The site is one of Canada's earliest documented Paleo-Indian quarries. Whether the deepest layers are also 30,000 years old depends on which archaeologist you ask, and how much weight they give to the original excavator's notes. The site sits on Anishinaabe territory, belonging to the Three Fires Confederacy. The 1991 excavations operated with an advisory committee that included Chief Norman Ognier of Sheguiandah, Chief Patrick Matabee of Ondek Omni-Kenning, and Wikwemekong historian Al Shawana. One final note. A book called Forbidden Archaeology, published by Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson in 1993, promoted Sheguiandah as a suppressed example of ancient human evidence. That book misreads a professional treatment scandal as archaeological vindication. It is not the same thing. The quarry is genuinely old and genuinely important. The deeper claim is genuinely unresolved, but it is not the smoking gun the fringe wants it to be. Number 3. L'Anse Amour. North shore of the Strait of Belle Isle, southern Labrador. A low, circular rise of stones on a gray, windswept coast. It is the oldest known First Nations funerary monument in the Americas. Roughly 7,700 years old. Older than the pyramids of Giza by 26 centuries. The name is L'Anse Amour, which sounds romantic but is actually a softening of the original name, L'Anse Amour, Cove of the Dead. The mound is 8 to 10 meters across, built of large stones piled over a burial chamber dug 1.5 meters deep. It was excavated by Robert McGee and James Tuck of Memorial University in 1974. What they found, buried beneath those stones, rearranged what archaeologists thought they knew about small hunter-gatherer bands in this part of the world. The body was a child, 12 or 13 years old, wrapped in a shroud of bark or hide, placed face down, head pointing west, covered in red ochre. On either side of the body, fires had burned. Grave goods had been placed with care. Stone and bone projectile points, a walrus tusk, a bird bone whistle, pigment stones, fish bones, maybe the remains of a ceremonial meal, and the oldest known toggling harpoon head in the world. A toggling harpoon is not a simple spear. When the point enters flesh, a small internal pivot causes the head to rotate inside the wound, locking it in place so the animal cannot pull free. It requires an understanding of rotational mechanics, of anatomy, of the physics of the hunt. It is a technology usually associated with much later stages of human development. And here it is, buried with a 12-year-old 77 centuries ago in Labrador. Which leaves the obvious question, why? Monumental burials, in the global archaeological record, tend to appear in stable, hierarchical, agricultural societies. They require labor, leadership, surplus, a community that can stop other work for a week and pile stones. Small mobile maritime archaic bands are not supposed to do this. They did it for a child. Nobody is sure why. The possibilities are narrow and interesting. Ascribed high status through kinship. The child may have been the heir of a powerful lineage. Ritually significant circumstances of death, possibly a drowning or hunting accident the community felt, had to be closed ceremonially. Or fear. The face-down orientation weighted with stones matches a pattern in much later ethnographic records for handling what Europeans would later call the restless dead. Bodies the community did not want coming back. James Tuck's published Understatement in 1993. The construction of burial mounds is traditionally associated with stable, agriculturally based societies, generally found in more temperate areas of the world. The discovery of such an ancient burial mound came as a surprise to many archaeologists. The blunt translation, this site broke expectations. Parks Canada updated the interpretive plaque in 2023. The new version includes translations in Innu Aimun and Inuktitut and directly addresses what the redesign team called colonial assumptions and outdated terminology. Contemporary archaeologists have noted, unprompted, that a burial excavation like this would not happen today under current ethics protocols. The child was dug up in 1974. In 2026, that would be a long conversation with descendant communities before a single stone was moved. We do not have a name. We do not have a reason. We have a child, a hunting tool centuries ahead of its time, a fire on each side, and 77 centuries of silence. Number 2, Bluefish Caves. We started here. Now we come back. They are 3 limestone caves in the northern Yukon, in Vuntut Gwich'in territory, near the community of Old Crow. They were excavated between 1977 and 1987 by a Canadian Museum of Civilization archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars. Cinq-Mars found bones, mammoth, horse, caribou, and bison. On those bones were cut marks, parallel scoring, the kind produced by a stone tool slicing flesh off bone. He argued, based on the associated radiocarbon dates, that humans had been inside those caves approximately 24,000 years ago. That claim did not land well. The Clovis First model placed human arrival in the Americas at 13 or 14,000 years ago. Cinq-Mars was claiming 11,000 years earlier than that in the far north, during the last glacial maximum. The response was a long, slow, professional dismissal. For 2 decades, mainstream opinion held that the cut marks could be ambiguous, maybe carnivore teeth, maybe sediment abrasion, maybe rocks shifting in the cave, publication doors closed, funding dried up. Cinq-Mars' interpretation was treated, at best, as premature. And then, in 2017, Lauriane Bourgeon and Ariane Burke at the University of Montreal, with Thomas Hyam at Oxford, re-examined the assemblage under higher resolution microscopy. They published in the journal PLOS One. The paper title alone tells the story. Earliest human presence in North America, dated to the last glacial maximum. New radiocarbon dates from Bluefish Caves, Canada. Their conclusion strengthened the case substantially. The cut marks were human. The dates held up. The bones were about 24,000 calendar years old. Bluefish Caves is now central to the Beringian standstill hypothesis. The idea, supported independently by ancient genomics, that a founder population lived in isolation in the Bering Land Bridge region for thousands of years before dispersing south. The Upward Sun River infant genome, recovered in Alaska in 2015, confirmed that an ancient Beringian lineage diverged from ancestral Native American lineage roughly 20,000 years ago. This is consistent with the Bluefish dates. A 2023 paper in Proceedings of the Royal Society frames the model as one of expansion into the Arctic plain during the last glacial maximum. Bluefish Caves sits near the start of that timeline. Some skepticism remains. Ben Potter at the University of Alaska Fairbanks has been careful, and he has said that for people to be that far north at last glacial maximum times, you would need a lot of compelling evidence. Mainstream discussion has shifted, though. The question is no longer whether the evidence is real. It is how the evidence fits into the bigger picture. The Vuntut Gwich'in have their own position on all of this. The caves in the Old Crow Basin are central to their heritage. Their ancestors have been on that land since the caribou have been on that land. the archaeological consensus is just now catching up, which is a recurring theme on this list. Number 1. The disappearance of the Dorset. Every other site has a working theory, a leading interpretation most archaeologists would defend. This one does not. The Dorset culture occupied the eastern Arctic for about 2,000 years, from 500 BCE to 1400 CE. Their range covered Nunavut, Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, Newfoundland, and parts of Greenland. At their peak, there were somewhere around 3,000 in the Canadian Arctic, plus another 1,000 in Greenland. 4,000 people, spread across a territory roughly the size of Western Europe. They were unlike any people before or since. The Dorset had no bows and arrows. They had no dogs, no dog sleds, no bow drills. They gouged lenticular holes in their tools instead of drilling round ones. They hunted sea mammals with lances at breathing holes, not with harpoons from boats. They built stone-outlined longhouses up to 45 meters long. On Ellesmere Island, one of these longhouses stretches the length of a football field. They spun yarn from musk ox and Arctic hare fur, using techniques that involved no spinning wheel. And in the last few centuries of their existence, their art changed. Late Dorset art exploded with shamanic imagery. Soapstone flying bears, ivory masquettes, full-sized wooden masks, beings with multiple faces, beings caught mid-transformation. Some of the most sophisticated representational art ever produced in the Arctic, and then between roughly 1300 and 1500 CE, they were just gone. In August 2014, a geneticist named Maanasa Raghavan and a team including Eska Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen published a paper in Science that settled a 100-year-old question. They sequenced genome-wide data from 154 ancient individuals across the Arctic. The genetic continuity of the Paleo-Eskimo period, the Dorset, was interrupted by the arrival of a new population representing the ancestors of modern Inuit. Willerslev said, "I cannot remember any other evidence of a population having such low diversity in the mitochondrial DNA." The Dorset had been genetically distinct. When they disappeared, their genetic signature mostly disappeared with them. The Thule, the ancestors of modern Inuit, arrived from Alaska around 1250 CE. They did not meaningfully absorb the Dorset. The two populations largely did not mix. This is one of the cleanest population turnovers anywhere in the human archaeological record. And here is where Inuit oral tradition becomes decisive. In 1922, the Danish ethnographer Knud Rasmussen traveled the Canadian Arctic and recorded what Inuit elders told him about Hava people who had lived on the land before them. The stories were extraordinarily consistent. The previous inhabitants were called the Tuniat, or the Sivulirmiut, the first inhabitants. They were described as large, strong, shy, and peaceful. They spoke a simple language called Kutak. They lacked bows and arrows. They were skilled stoneworkers. They were kind, and they were driven out. That description, recorded from oral memory 400 years after the events, matches the archaeological profile of the Dorset exactly. Every element, the size, the tools, the absence of bows, the peaceful characterization. An elder named Eva Luarjuk told Rasmussen that the Tuniat were a strong people, and yet they were driven from their villages by others who were more numerous. So greatly did they love their country that when they were leaving, here the translation trails off, because the elder's sentence trailed off. Robert McGee, one of the Arctic's most respected archaeologists, summarized the pattern this way. Inuit oral history relates that when their ancestors arrived in Arctic Canada a few centuries ago, they found the country occupied by a tribe of large, strong, and inoffensive strangers whom they called Tuniat, and whom the ancestral Inuit soon drove from their lands. 4 theories currently compete to explain what happened. None of them exclude the others. Climate change, the medieval warm period from 950 to 1250 CE, reduced sea ice extent across the Arctic. The Dorset relied heavily on stable sea ice for breathing hole sealing. Their food system was built on ice that was becoming less reliable every generation. Thule displacement. The Thule arrived from Alaska with bows, dogs, dog sleds, umiaks, and open water whaling. They could hunt bowhead whales. They could travel faster. They were, by any competitive metric, technologically superior. William Fitzhugh, who has spent his career on this question, put it this way: the Dorset were, in a sense, sitting ducks. Disease. Their extraordinarily low mitochondrial diversity suggests a genetically narrow population with corresponding immune vulnerability. A pathogen brought in by the Thule or arriving on its own could have collapsed the population faster than it could recover. Failure to adapt. No bows meant limited caribou hunting. No dogs meant limited transport. No whaling meant no access to the calorie-rich resource the Thule were riding across the Arctic. Even without displacement or disease, the Dorset economy may simply have collapsed under its own constraints. Robert Park at the University of Waterloo summed up the real mystery. Why did the Dorset disappear so completely? They did not leave refugees. They did not leave hybrid communities. The Sadlermiad of Southampton Island, long thought to be Dorset survivors, turned out under genetic analysis to be Thule people who had adopted some Dorset tools. The Dorset themselves, as a people, are gone. This is the only entry on this list where the honest answer to what happened is that we do not know. Not rhetorically, literally. A people with a continental range, a sophisticated art tradition, a 2,000-year history, and a name we can still pronounce, cease to exist on an entire continent in a window of perhaps 200 years, leaving no language, almost no genetic heirs, and no agreed-upon explanation. They left longhouses. They left lamps. They left 180 faces on a Hudson Strait island. And they left a memory, in the oral tradition of the people who came after them, of a gentle people who loved their country so much that the elder recording the story could not finish the sentence about leaving it. There is a pattern running through this list, and it is not the pattern YouTube archaeology usually sells. At L'Anse Amour Meadows, the Norse sagas were dismissed as myth for centuries, until an archaeologist followed a local fisherman to the longhouses the sagas had said were there. At Head Smashed Inn, Blackfoot oral tradition preserved the name of a boy crushed against the cliff. The bone bed below held 12 meters of bison remains. The story was not folklore, it was instructions for reading the site. At Kay-Nah-Chi-Wah-Nung, the Rainy River First Nations carried an origin story about a sickness, a lodge of birch bark, and burial in mounds. The archaeological record does not contradict it, it runs alongside it. At Bluefish Caves, the archaeologist was ignored for 40 years. The Vuntut Gwich'in already knew. On Tree Island on the central British Columbia coast, William Husty of the Hailtsuk Nation said something worth sitting with. When we go into negotiations, our oral history is what we bring to the table. So now we do not just have oral history, we have archaeological information too. His grandfather's grandfather told him about a strip of land that never froze during the Ice Age. The radiocarbon dates when they came back were about 14,000 years old. The pattern keeps showing up. The mystery in most of these cases is not that we have no information, it is that we had the information the whole time and we spent a long time refusing to listen to the people who were holding it. It only starts to make sense when archaeologists take indigenous knowledge seriously. Some things on this list remain genuinely unknown. The child under the stones at L'Anse Amour, the disappearance of the Dorset, the faces at Qajartalik, the population math at Keatley Creek, the deepest layers at Sheguiandah, the astronomical claims at Majorville. Some of these will be answered in our lifetimes. Some will not. A few, like Qajartalik and the Peterborough Petroglyphs, may not be meant to be answered at all, because the communities whose ancestors made them have decided some knowledge belongs to them and not to the rest of us. The land is older than the country. The stories are older than the archaeology. And the evidence, if you listen to all of it, tends to line up in a way that makes Canada a stranger and far more ancient place than most of its citizens have any idea. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.